feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to One of 200, Aotearoa's independent news and politics podcast. I'm Paul, your co-host for another interview edition of the cast, where I'm once again joined by Max Harris. Max is a lawyer and campaigner who I interviewed for One of 200 last year in the lead-up to the controversial Auckland Council budget, where Mayor Wayne Brown was successful in slashing spending and privatising some of the council shares in Auckland Airport. Now Mayor Brown is back with a disastrous long-term plan proposal which seeks to sell even more assets and entrench a low rates and low investment approach for the next decade. Unless, of course, it's resisted by the councillors and the public. So I'm delighted to have Max with me to go over all of this. Welcome, Max. Thanks for coming along.
Kia ora, Paul. Nice to be here.
Awesome. So let's dive right into it. So the Mayor's proposed this long-term plan. He's put out his proposal document. So what is a long-term plan? I guess maybe a bit about how it differs from a budget, and what's some of this stuff in it, and what do we need to be looking out for?
Yeah, so a budget is a plan for the year ahead for a council, and a long-term plan, as the name suggests, is a plan for 10 years. So it's essentially setting some guardrails for what councils can do and some goals that will then affect each budget that comes in the years ahead.
So the Mayor's proposed quite a lot of big things in this long-term plan, stuff around assets. There's like a long-term focus around expenditure and rates, all those things that we spoke about in our podcast last year. But what are some of the key things that we should be focusing on as part of this long-term plan?
Yeah, so just to add a little to what I said just now, I think why a long-term plan is important is this potentially can lock Auckland in for the next 10 years to a particular path. And that means the stakes are higher than just with a one-year budget. And there are some key battlegrounds here with this long-term plan. So one is what happens to the remaining Auckland airport shares. So people will remember some of the Auckland airport shares were sold off last year, and that was limited partly because of the really good public campaigning that pushed back against the sale of all Auckland airport shares. So one question is, what happens to the remaining Auckland airport shares? Do they stay in public hands? Another question is, what happens to Auckland's port? We know that Wayne Brown really wants to move Auckland Port, and changing the settings with the port is kind of one of the reasons he's gone into politics. The proposal this year is to put the port out to an operating lease, so leasing out the port operations to a private company. That's the second battleground.
Yeah, just on that. So at the moment, how does it work, I guess, for someone who's doesn't really know much about the port and how it runs? Is the council runner, or is it a bit more sort of directly publicly run?
So there's Ports of Auckland Limited, which is this arm's length entity which runs the port operations, and the land is in public ownership. And essentially what Wayne Brown is proposing is that the operations are sliced out to a company, and he says, the land stays in public ownership. So that's kind of second battleground. Then, there's a couple of other battlegrounds too. Wayne Brown's been pushing a long-term asset sales target, and there's a lot of euphemism and, words to hide what is actually going on in this document, but he's actually pretty upfront and just uses those words, asset sales target, and he wants $300 million of assets to be sold over 10 years. He strongly suggests that parks are one type of asset that might be sold. So that's another big area of battle is, do these assets get sold? And then related to that, what level of rates will be set to fund services, how much borrowing will occur mainly to spend on infrastructure, on council infrastructure.
So it sounds like this is sort of a massive plank in Wayne Brown's overall kind of agenda, foregrounded largely by their budget last year, but this pushes a lot of that kind of stuff forward. Maybe before we get into some of the detail with some of the stuff, we'll talk about the Future Fund proposal first, but if you don't go any further listening to this podcast, the consultation for this long-term plan closes this Thursday, the 28th of March. So be sure to jump online, have a quick look at the documents, and please get your feedback through to the council, because it's really important that as many people submit on this as possible, so we can get as little of the bad stuff through and as much of the good stuff through as we can, I guess. So let's have a chat about this future fund. So this is where I guess, well, it's sort of the future for a lot of the council-owned assets, and it's a proposal that's been put forward by the Mayor to create a wealth fund that the council will run. And there's supposed to be a lot of benefits for that leading into the future to diversify the council's asset pool and so on. Can you tell the audience a little bit about like what that is, maybe some of the problems with it? It all sounds really nice. There's a lot of good language around it. But as we know, the devil's always in the details. So what should we be looking out for with this proposal?
Yeah, so as you say, the idea of having a fund that's committed to invest in the future of Auckland sounds like a good idea. There's a reason I didn't mention the Future Fund as one of the key battlegrounds, because in my view, this is a way to package up the privatisations that Wayne Brown really wants to push through in this long-term plan. And so the key part of this Future Fund is that rather than local government putting in startup capital, or the capital being taken from an existing public revenue source, like an ongoing stream, this fund is being set up by selling off the Auckland Airport shares and leasing the port operating lease. That's the proposal. So I think one big question or problem for people to think about is, do we want to sell these assets as a way to start up this fund? A second problem for people to think about is a lot of this fund could be invested into assets or services that actually compete with Auckland. And this is a point that Craig Rennie made on a recent webinar. So it's not necessarily in the future interests of Auckland. Another third problem that people might think of with this fund is that it's going to employ private investment advisors, financial advisors, and that's going to take out a big slice of Auckland money. Is that something we want? Is that how we want Auckland Council to be thinking about its future? Other people have called this a kind of, a public, investment fund or gambling fund. So I think, there are some serious questions to ask about it. There are much more public options of this, like local development banks or, local public investment funds where the government puts in some startup money. But this looks to me much more like what Thatcher and people during Rogernomics in New Zealand in the 80s and 90s said, which was when they justified privatising, they said, don't worry, this money is going to be reinvested back into the community. And so I see it much more through that lens rather than through the lens of an attractive sounding fund for the future.
Yeah, and one thing that I saw in the proposal, the consultation document for the long-term plan, was around this need to protect, the city from future financial shocks, particularly ones caused by, obviously, we've recently had Cyclone Gabrielle and the Auckland anniversary floods last year. These types of things cause a lot of damage to the city. They require, council buildings potentially to be, repaired or what have you, or, if there's additional money required for stormwater and so on. And I saw something in the proposal that part of this fund could be used for self-insurance. So instead of taking expensive insurance out to cover the council's, these expenses that might come up in the future for the council, they could dip into this fund, and also they might not recapitalise that then. So I kind of read that as very much this fund being essentially, all the assets, as you pointed out earlier, being sold to start this fund, could then just be used to do those things that the council should actually be investing in anyway. So how do you respond to that? Like, obviously these are good things that we need to be worrying about, like the future protection of the city. But yeah, how should we be doing that? And does this fund do it in a good way, I guess?
Yeah. No, so there's a legitimate question to ask here, like how do councils approach insurance where the private insurance market might be reluctant to insure, for example, places like Wellington. But there are actually lots of answers to that question, lots of potential answers to that question. Something, for example, that's been done in the UK a lot is risk pooling across councils to provide self-insurance, and that hasn't been developed as much in Aotearoa as in the UK. That's like one possible answer. Also, councils could set aside this money without selling off assets to put into a fund to do this. The other point to make is there's a lot of talk in this long-term plan about resilience. In my view, and there's evidence to back this up, a council that sells off its assets is much less resilient in several specific ways than a council that holds on to its assets. So in one specific way is that a council is in a stronger borrowing position if it has a strong asset base. So rating agencies actually look at the strength of a government's asset base, and if you're whittling down that asset base, you're actually in some ways becoming less resilient. It's also interesting to note that, like, if you scroll through the long-term plan, you get to a section on seismic strengthening, and Wayne Brown has a go at government red tape and says he's talking to David Seymour about whether they really need to invest so much in seismic strengthening, which makes you wonder how much at least this mayor is committed to making Auckland resilient in the long term.
Yeah, good points. And I just wanted to touch on something that you talked about around the way that these assets are looked at. And I guess this is something that I've thought about a little bit around what we think of assets, to be for, or public assets, that is. And this fund seems to be obviously focused on return, right? Financial return. And if it's not delivering a return, then it's not a good asset. But maybe we could just backtrack a little bit to some of the things that we talked about last time around what makes a good public asset. Like why, I'm sure the mayor would argue that holding on to the airport itself might not be that strategic if it's not going to be making money, and wouldn't this future fund be better because we can then use the capital, free up the capital from the airport and invest it in something that might be making money when the airport's not. So, yeah, how should we look at those arguments? Is there other things that a public asset is for apart from just returning revenues to the council?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, as you say that, it makes me think one way that the mayor is sort of like looking at all these assets is almost like a set of shares that he's receiving a return from, and he's looking at like how valuable these shares are. But what I'd say is, yeah, that's the wrong way to think about these public assets. So another way to think about these assets is as infrastructure for a city that can be coordinated, including in times of natural disaster. Like we saw that in New Zealand in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was pretty important that airports were coordinated with public hospitals, which was coordinated with other parts of the public sector to ensure a kind of whole of government response. So I think it's really important to see them as infrastructure. These are also assets that are providing services in many cases. So, other assets that we're talking about here are things like, pools, libraries, parks. And these are assets that you don't necessarily want to make a profit from, right? And the whole point of the government owning them is that they don't have to make a profit. Like the government can look at its overall balance sheet, if we are going to use that term, and decide that it's worth investing in these because they contribute to better lives. Also, if we are going to think about them in economistic terms, having more people exercise, having more people be educated through libraries might reduce costs elsewhere. But yeah, we shouldn't think of all of them in cost-benefit terms, and we should also think about them as infrastructure and as shared services. And if I could add one more thing, I think if we are to talk about like quality of life, for those people listening in Auckland at least, if you think about like what are the things you enjoy in Auckland, maybe not everything, but a lot of things you could think about, like using public transport, going to the park on the weekends, going to the art gallery, going to the town hall. I know these things are not things that everyone does, but these things have come from investment over time. And they've also come often from borrowing. And if we want a city that we enjoy and we want good lives, we need to hold on to these assets.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier this asset sales target. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. So in the new fiscal responsibility rules that Mayor Brown has proposed in this long-term plan are a bunch of quite conservative fiscal rules for the council for the next 10 years. And a lot of them expand or change existing rules that are there, such as the debt limit and so on. We'll come to all that. But in regards to assets, one that's sort of come out of left field a little bit is this asset sales target of $300 million that the mayor wants to generate from selling assets. And obviously there was a big debate about the airport last year and now the port. Specific assets, which it's kind of worthwhile having this debate when it comes up, right? Because it makes us think about, like you said before, these assets as infrastructure and what they're specifically providing or could provide for the city. But this particular sales target for me was a bit of a red flag because it seemed to kind of open up asset sales as a broader objective, that the council shouldn't actually be holding assets or should only hold them under very limited circumstances. So could you talk a little bit about that and, should we be concerned about that? Or am I sort of, getting a bit worried about nothing?
No, we should be concerned about it. And like you say, it looks sort of nakedly ideological to say a target here is a certain value, 300 million. It's not small in terms of council money over 10 years on Wayne Brown's proposal. And then he's actually thrown another option in there, which is 300 million over 3 years. I think this is really, really worrying for the reasons we've already talked about, like for why public ownership is important. And we could add in other things about why public assets are important. So, the state that borrows more cheaply, the state can achieve economies of scale, the state can coordinate at the local level and at the central level. And these are all good reasons for the government to run things. And I think we need to hold on to that, especially as progressives are on the left, and make privatisation a kind of red line that we don't want to cross. And to be specific, as I said earlier, there's some pretty concerning things that Mayor Brown wants to be sold off, including parks, which he explicitly says he thinks there's a lot of council-owned parks that council perhaps shouldn't own. Those are spaces where people take their kids, where people take their dogs and for walks. This is where people enjoy time with friends to figure out difficult things in life. Like these are really important spaces, and once you sell them, you may never get them back. So I think, it's really important we take a stand. And one thing to add is he also wants to make it easier for local boards to optimize their assets. So as you say, it's sort of privatisation all the way down for 10 years with rolling targets. And if we don't say no to this now, then when? Exactly.
And that makes me think about the budget vote last year and the sort of compromise that was put on the table around partial privatisation of the airport, which has kind of inevitably led to this. But a couple of other things around that asset sales target is that I noticed, not in the consultation document, but in the mayor's proposal document, which I think may have come out earlier in advance of the consultation, it went even a little bit further to what you're describing just before. So there was a quote in the document that said there will be new policies established under that proposal to make asset sales easier and potentially increase the $300 million amount. Hopefully it's only $300. And some of the principles, the kind of red flags that came up to me were that the council shouldn't own assets or shouldn't hold assets unless they provide council services. So it wasn't just sort of any kind of services, but that seemed quite limited to me. And could, potentially lead to the sort of scope that you're talking about around parks and things like that being sold off. But maybe we should talk about some of these other fiscal rules that have come in. And then I guess just this broader project of a lack of investment in, well, both the long-term, capital projects, but lack of spending in the operational, expenditure budget lines and so on that's in this plan. So we spoke a lot about debt last time, and there was a debt ceiling that the council had, which you explained, and Mayor Brown has proposed to reduce this to $250 million. Can you maybe explain a little bit about that? Like, what is the $250 million? I think it's like a debt to revenue ratio or something.
50%. Yeah.
So is there any kind of implication? Like, how should we understand this particular rule?
Yeah. So in New Zealand, we seem to like these debt caps, which very simply are about putting a limit on how much the government can borrow. And just like step back a bit, we actually have really low government debt, local level and central level in New Zealand. And at the same time, we want to keep holding debt down. And as you said, Auckland Council picked its own debt limit, which is, debt to a proportion of the revenue that's coming in as a percentage. And so that went up to 290% during COVID, and then was brought down to 270%. As you say, Mayor Brown's talking about bringing the debt limit down to 250% of revenue. That sounds like a big number, and I actually think that debt to revenue ratio is picked partly to scare us with the size of that number. But actually, Auckland Council is nowhere near being in a risky borrowing position. It's got a very good credit rating if we are going to think about what rating agencies think of Auckland. There's no concern from those rating agencies. There's no concerns from others. So a lot of this panic is like self-generated by the politicians that want to hold debt down. And I think we need to understand that holding debt down at a central level and at a local level is simply a recipe for running down our infrastructure. That's why we've got leaking pipes in Wellington. It's why we've got poor quality water infrastructure. It's why we've got poor quality public transport infrastructure. And so we have to be able to talk about, sensible, reasonable borrowing, and we've got space for it.
Yeah, and I guess just to come back to some of the stuff we were talking about before, if we're reducing our debt, and I think I may have said 250 million before. Obviously, it was 250% of revenue. But if we're not investing enough to keep infrastructure up to speed, then that increases the risk of dipping into the future fund in future years. If we're not keeping our stormwater infrastructure or whatever it is up to scratch.
Also, just on this quickly, I think Noam Chomsky talks about this playbook of running down infrastructure and then saying, look, the government can't do this, so we better sell it off. And it's a cycle towards the government owning nothing at all and there being no infrastructure and no social state. And I think we should just keep that in mind. Yeah,
it's such a good point. And how do we, how do progressives respond to that? How do we kind of, if the right-wing playbook is to slowly whittle away the state and then be like, oh, well, the public service isn't good at providing X, Y, Z. How do we start to rebuild? What are the next small steps that we can take to, can we just bring some of the airport back into public ownership? What's the next logical step which a left-wing council would take to start to rebuild?
Yeah, I think we should be talking about this because there's a risk that we so focused on, fighting back that we lose sight of our imagination. I think some of the most exciting local governments around the world doing things like community wealth building are setting things up local development banks. So that's where the council commits some of its own money and lends it out for decarbonisation, job growth, innovation, councils investing in new public spaces, so public working spaces, expanding libraries so that they can be working spaces so that people don't have to, spend money on co-working spaces just to kind of do their jobs, expanding public transport, making public transport free, reducing the cost of services, supporting social services. In New Zealand, there's a pretty narrow range of infrastructure tasks that councils are focused on compared to overseas. The council could be engaging in pilot projects on free dental. There's actually nothing like in the legislation stopping that. And I think these are things that we should be fighting for. This is what we should be putting on the agenda for the next left-wing mayor, which I hope comes on as soon as possible.
Yeah, totally. And I guess just another thought on the debt, and it kind of relates to the next thing we'll talk about around rates, is if we're going to have a debt limit that's a certain percentage of revenue, the mayor has also proposed to limit rates revenue quite significantly in the long-term plan. So does that kind of logically follow that the debt, the actual amount of debt, not the percentage, would come down over the next number of years? Yeah,
I mean, if we hold down investment, from rates, and we hold down borrowing, it might actually mean that in 3 years' time, we have another horrific cyclone that reveals that we have massive gaps in our infrastructure that require more investment. It's like, do we want to be in a position in several years where we say, well, actually, we decided with no pressure from the outside to create a new cap, and so we can't borrow anymore to fix the broken infrastructure? I mean, it's wild, right? And just to touch on that rates limit, essentially it's a rates cap as well that Brown is trying to impose in a pretty autocratic way in some ways. This is a decision for the next 10 years. He's only been elected for 3 years.
And this is new, right? This doesn't actually exist at the moment.
No, it doesn't exist at the moment. It's pretty ridiculous, really. Rates are already really low in Auckland, and what Wayne Brown is saying is, you'd usually expect the amount you invest in services at least to go up by the level of inflation, and he's saying rates cannot go up any more than level of inflation. So he's basically ruling out any kind of rates increase. And yeah, that has no consideration for urgent investment that might be needed in future cyclones and future climate events and future social events. But also it holds back our imagination in wanting to invest in some of those innovative ideas that I've just mentioned that other councils around the world are doing, because we'd be held back because we'd say, well, actually, no, sorry, in the long-term plan, we decided to put a permanent cap on debt and a permanent cap on rates.
Yeah, and this is one thing that really concerns me about this rates limit, is that it doesn't exist at the moment. It's a new kind of precedent that's being developed. And the debt limit is something that, we've talked about its faults, but I guess it's kind of, it's pretty broadly accepted across the left and the right that we should have some kind of debt limit, right? That we should have a restriction on, I'm not saying that I agree with that, but, if you were to ask all the councillors on the left at the moment, they would probably say, we need to have some kind of debt limit. It's just a matter of how much it is, right? Some people might want more or less. But with this rates limit, it doesn't exist at the moment. And so I really fear that in a few years' time, it will just become like the debt limit is now, where we're not debating whether it's good or not. We're just saying whether it needs to be a little bit more or a little bit less. Do you think that's a risk? And how do we get out of that kind of cycle? What would you say to the idea that we shouldn't have a debt limit at all? Is that fiscally irresponsible?
No, I totally get your point now. Yeah, and you're right. So in the same way as low debt has been normalized by these debt limits, this is a way of further entrenching low rates, low levels of local taxation. And I think in a way it's, New Zealand doesn't have a single written constitution, but this is becoming, a kind of constitution in the sense of it's these are the core fundamental rules that tie the hands of government, and they're tying the hands of the government in the direction of lower investment, lower support. I think I think we should be really critical about debt caps and the self-imposed debt caps. Shamabeel Yaqub, hardly a radical, called Auckland's debt cap idiotic. And I think the way we push back on this is through all of us in our conversation, challenging those people that say, we have to keep debt low, challenging those people that say we need to keep rates low. And you were asking about this earlier, but pointed to examples where, for all of its problems, we do still have a health system that's saving people's lives and providing a free, at least emergency service at the moment. We still have an education system that is, very effective in lots of ways, as much as it has its problems too. And, that has come from investment for free free services. We have to point to that. We have to keep building on that, pointing to the infrastructure that we have that is good. We actually do have pretty decent trains. We just have this very cramped, limited network because of our restrictive infrastructure investment in Auckland. We can, shift this. And maybe just say one more thing about privatisation and the last 30 or 40 years. A lot of people talk about why we have such an individualistic society in New Zealand. And then a lot of people also say that's partly from 30 to 40 years of privatisation and cuts to public services, which have made us more of a market society. If we ever want to get out of that, we have to push back at this kind of thing. This is pushing more market values, more individualistic values, less collective values. These are things that just make for worse living.
Totally. Let's talk about the process a little bit. So I mentioned earlier that the consultation on the long-term plan closes on Thursday, the 28th. So please jump online and submit on that. But Max, what should people be submitting? So I noticed that quite cleverly, the Mayor has put his proposal up as the kind of sensible centre proposal, and there's a do less for less rates proposal and a do more for more rates proposal. And I thought it was very clever, but because a lot of people are probably going to be trying to resist the do less proposal, right? So the compromise might be Mayor Brown's proposal, but is even this do more proposal good? I'm sure that there's bad stuff still in that one. What should people be doing when confronted with this particular question?
Yeah. Oh, it's clever, right? But it's the oldest trick in the political hack book to say, there's an extreme option on either side, and my option in the middle is the most sensible. So I think we can all see through that. As you say, the do more option still has its problems. There's actually still a much smaller asset sales target in part of that. So we're being laid out with a menu of different degrees of privatisation here. I mean, it's a pretty sad indictment on the political choices that Mayor Brown's leaving us. So my suggestion is that write your own submission. So don't do a template submission. By all means, look at some of the submission guides that are out there, including from It's Our Auckland, MUNS, others. But write it in your own words. And my suggestion would be to say, you like the direction of the do more option, but you don't want to see the sale of any assets, and you perhaps want to see more investment in both infrastructure and services. So we can kind of resist those three choices that Wayne Brown's given us and say, actually, we've got more choices, and try and spell out what you do differently. And if you don't have heaps of time, I think even just saying I support investment, I don't support selling local assets, is a good submission.
And who are some of the kind of key players involved here? So, we've got I'm sure a decision is going to come up sometime. You might be able to provide us with some more information on that. A decision at council, who gets to decide, who can influence the decision, and how do we get involved?
Yeah. So maybe let's start with the campaigners. I'll try and do this real shortly, but I think on the progressive side, Better Budget for Auckland, which I was involved with last year, has kind of reformed and is around. Check them out on social media. There's also another group I've been involved with called It's Our Auckland. So both of those groups are pushing for a different progressive long-term plan. Then there are some unions and environmental groups as well. So 350, MUNS, which is the Maritime Union, which knows a lot about the port. Check those players out. On the right side, we've got Auckland Ratepayers Alliance, which is putting out polling and pushing for privatisation. That's what they're all about. Then, as you say, let's come to who makes these decisions. So we've got the councillors. What we had last year was this awkward alliance where about 7 of the councillors you would expect to vote for selling off the airport shares did. And then I think I'm right with the numbers to say 3, maybe it was 8, and then we had 3 progressive councillors that essentially voted for the sale of the Auckland airport shares. So that was Richard Hills, Shane Henderson, and Chris Darby, and Julie Ferry abstained. And then you had this interesting situation where some councillors generally seen as conservative actually opposed the sale of the shares. So councillors Walker and Watson and possibly one other that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. And I think there's going to be an interesting similar battles this year. And there's a question of, how will all those progressive councillors vote? There's potentially enough support for a majority of those councillors to oppose all sale of assets and to decide that a more resilient city is one that holds on to their assets. And I really hope that, councillors Hills and Ferry and Henderson and Derby, who have done good work in between to kind of push back at Wayne Brown, that they acknowledge the need not to sell off our assets. And we also see Walker and Watson and Mike Lee is the other one, that they will also oppose the sale of assets. But we need to make sure investment goes up as well. And there are difficult compromises for those councillors to work on. But that's why it's really important that we speak from the outside. Obviously, Wayne Brown and his office is another important set of players. The media, there are some key media players, including Bernard Orsman, who generally is the writer for the Herald who writes on local government, generally takes a sympathetic view of austerity and cuts and asset sales. Simon Wilson in the Herald tends to take a slightly more critical view, and we also have other key commentators. But it's really important that there's public pressure. The councillors felt that last year, and it's important that Aucklanders send a message that asset sales are not okay, that we need investment and we need an inclusive city in our hands.
Totally. I think, was it Christine Fletcher's maybe also made some kind of anti-asset sale noises? So there is there's potential for coalitions there, right? And I guess one thing that I noticed is that sometimes, progressive councillors can see that or think that there's a trade-off between assets and saving operating cuts, right? Operating expense cuts, and that if we have to sell the assets in order to prevent cuts from happening. But as you said before, when we're talking about these rules, right, we can have both. We don't have to have these conservative debt rules. It's about making sure that our public politics, our local councils, our government provides the services that we want and that we can use, and we can all contribute to that. And as you said, rates are very low in Auckland and around the country.
Just to pick up on that real briefly, so Wayne Brown is definitely going to say, if you want to hold on to the port and the airport, you're going to have to pay skyrocketing rates. So how do you answer that if someone says that to you? Well, remember this, like in a newsroom article that recently got put out, Auckland's rate increases for this year were the second lowest in the country, the proposed rates increases. So a lot of councils around the country see slightly higher rates after COVID and after the cost of living crisis. So we could definitely have a higher rates increase and still be very much in the middle of the pack in the country. That's one response. Second response is, we need to be willing to stop holding rates down if we want decent services and decent infrastructure. And then we also need to talk about borrowing and being willing to borrow a little bit more than what Brown would allow.
And rates are based on property values as well, right? So obviously those have increased a fair bit over the last 10 years or so. And so I think we can expect people who own property to pay a little bit more for a better city. But that's probably a conversation for another day. Just very quickly, there's some stuff that's going on in Wellington that's quite similar, isn't it, around developing a future fund proposal. So, what can you tell us about that?
So I don't live in Wellington. I'm not as close to everything that's going on there, but the council has a bigger shareholding in the airport in Wellington, and there is a proposal to sell that all off. And I think all of the arguments for holding on to the airport that applied in Auckland last year apply in Wellington too. And I know some environmental people will be like, why do we? Some environmental activists, people that rightly, want us to get our flying down would say, why should we own an airport? Well, as we said last year, actually, you want airports in public hands as we manage a just transition. You don't want airports in the hands of people who are driven by profit and growth. Yeah, exactly. So I think there needs to be pushback. I think there are alternatives in Wellington. One big argument that's come up in Wellington is around insurance. So the earthquake risk being higher in Wellington, private insurers not being willing to insure. It's clear that some money does need to be set aside for insurance, and there does need to be creative thinking, including through risk pooling. But I think we really need to resist the idea that there is no alternative other than selling the airport. That's just not true. I think there are other options in Wellington, and I really hope that the Green-led Council in Wellington pursues those other options.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, Max. Once again, if you're out there and you care about this budget and this long-term plan, jump online and submit. Let the council know your views, and let's hope for a good result. Any last thoughts, Max, before we say goodbye?
Yeah, one thought is if you're listening to this and it's after Thursday the 28th of March, the journey hasn't ended. So we've got until May to influence this proposal. So definitely submit if you're listening to this before Thursday 28th of March. If you're listening to this after that, get in touch with your councillor or any councillors. Tell them your views. Look at the organisations around that are pushing on this, like It's Our Auckland, Better Budget for Auckland, 350 MUNs. Support them, share their content on social media, and continue to have conversations with people about opposing privatisation, about raising debt in sensible ways, but why we shouldn't hold debt rates down, because that's the way we're going to shift the common sense in this country to something that is actually more common sense than this wild approach to low debt and low taxes, which has harmed all of us. And we can do better, and we will do better if we all fight in that way.
Awesome, Max. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much to our listeners for checking this out. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. Maybe drop us a few dollars in our Patreon. Be sure to share it with your friends. And we will see you again on the podcast very soon. Bye for now.
Living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paid with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. I live amongst the people every day. In this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain, it feels like we're on the road to hell.